Nobody expected what happened next. The debate had started like any other, a typical back and forth between two seasoned politicians. But when Senator Lucas Harrington, a fiery Democrat known for his aggressive rhetoric, decided to take a personal shot at JD Vance, the entire tone shifted. The audience expected JD to flinch, to stumble, but instead his calm, precise response left the entire debate hall in stunned silence. The stage lights in the Washington Public Affairs Forum burned bright, casting an almost theatrical glow over the two podiums where JD Vance and Senator Lucas Harrington stood. The debate had been advertised as one of the most anticipated political showdowns of the year, a direct clash between two rising forces in American politics. The moderator, Angela Whitmore, a veteran journalist, adjusted her glasses as she addressed the national audience watching from home. Tonight, we are joined by two key figures in the debate over America's future. Vice President JD Vance, representing the Republican Party, and Senator Lucas Harrington, a leading voice in the Democratic Senate. The camera panned across the packed auditorium, where hundreds of political analysts, reporters, and invited guests sat in hushed anticipation. Everyone knew this wouldn't be a quiet policy discussion. This was going to be a war of words. Angela turned toward the candidates. Gentlemen, let's begin with a topic that has sparked national controversy: economic policy and the future of the American workforce. Lucas Harrington smirked, adjusting his navy blue tie. Well, Angela, let's start with the obvious. The policies of the current administration, an administration in which Mr. Vance serves as vice president, have been disastrous for middle-class Americans. He turned toward JD, gesturing vaguely. Under your leadership, we've seen wages stagnate, costs of living skyrocket, and tax cuts that benefit the wealthy while leaving working families behind. The numbers don't lie, JD. Your policies are failing the American people. JD Vance didn't flinch. He nodded slightly, waiting for Harrington to finish. Then, with a measured tone, he responded, Senator, I find it interesting that you bring up tax cuts as a problem when your party's policies have done nothing but punish the middle class. You talk about wages stagnating, yet it's your administration's inflationary spending that has devalued the dollar, making it harder for families to afford everyday necessities. The audience murmured. Harrington's smile stiffened. JD continued, You claim we cut taxes for the wealthy. But let's talk about the reality. Our tax cuts allowed small businesses to expand, working-class families to keep more of their paychecks, and investments in American industry to grow. Meanwhile, your party is more interested in handing out subsidies to billion-dollar corporations that push political agendas than actually helping struggling Americans. Angela Whitmore glanced at Harrington. Senator, your response? Harrington chuckled, shaking his head. That's classic conservative spin. You talk about tax cuts and inflation, but let's look at the real issue, the wealth gap. Under your leadership, JD, the rich have only gotten richer while the poor get poorer. Maybe that's why so many working-class people are turning against your policies. JD let the comment hang for a second before leaning slightly forward. Senator Harrington, you talk about working-class people turning against us, but last time I checked, they're the ones leaving your cities in record numbers. New York, California, Illinois, all Democrat-led states are seeing an exodus of families, workers, and businesses. If your policies are so great, why is no one staying? The audience reacted audibly. Harrington tensed. JD wasn't finished. You want to talk about the wealth gap? Then let's talk about the politicians who claim to fight for the poor while living in gated mansions and sending their kids to private schools while opposing school choice for the rest of America. Let's talk about your party pretending to represent blue-collar workers while shutting down industries that put food on their tables. Harrington's face darkened. JD smiled slightly. Your party doesn't serve working Americans, Senator. You serve elite donors, lobbyists, and the industries that profit from keeping people dependent on government. The room was dead silent. Even the moderator looked momentarily taken aback. Harrington clenched his jaw, gripping the edge of his podium. That's a nice speech, JD, he said finally, but rhetoric doesn't fix problems. JD nodded. You're right. Action does. That's why we cut taxes, increased manufacturing jobs, and work to secure the border, because protecting American jobs starts with protecting America. The audience erupted in applause. Harrington muttered something under his breath, looking to Angela Whitmore for help. Angela cleared her throat. Let's move to the next topic. But JD wasn't finished. One last thing, he said, his voice cutting through the noise. The room quieted. Senator, you like to say we're failing the American people. But let me ask you this. If your policies are working, why do Americans keep rejecting them at the ballot box? Harrington's expression froze. Because here's the truth, JD continued. Americans don't want more taxes, inflation, and government control. They want freedom, they want security, and they want leaders who actually listen to them, not politicians who mock their values while living in luxury. More applause. This time, it was louder. Harrington forced a tight smile, but the damage was done. JD Vance had just won the debate. The applause in the debate hall grew louder, rippling across the audience in a way that even the moderator, Angela Whitmore, couldn't ignore. She hesitated for a moment, glancing towards Senator Lucas Harrington, who stood stiffly at his podium, his fingers gripping the edge as if anchoring himself against the overwhelming shift in the room's energy. JD Vance had just turned the tide, and everyone could feel it. Angela cleared her throat. Senator Harrington, would you like to respond before we move to the next topic? Harrington forced a chuckle, shaking his head. You're really good at avoiding the actual issue, JD, he said, trying to regain his composure. You stand here and talk about freedom, but let's get real. Your administration's policies have been a disaster for everyday Americans. JD tilted his head slightly, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Is that so? Harrington nodded. Absolutely. Let's talk about healthcare, for example. Millions of Americans still can't afford basic medical care, yet your administration has done nothing to fix that. Instead, you fought against universal healthcare policies that would help the working class. JD clasped his hands in front of him. Help the working class? He let the words hang in the air for a moment. Senator, your idea of help is forcing Americans into a government-controlled system where bureaucrats decide what care they get and when they get it. What we opposed was government overreach, not healthcare reform. He turned slightly toward the audience. Here's the difference between our approach and yours. We believe Americans should have the freedom to choose their own healthcare, their own doctors, and their own plans. You believe the government should make those choices for them. A few audience members clapped in agreement. Harrington scoffed. That's rich coming from someone whose party gutted protections for pre-existing conditions. JD's smile didn't fade. That's an outright lie, and you know it. We expanded coverage options while lowering costs through market-driven reforms. What we didn't do was force Americans into a failing government system that collapses under its own weight. Like what we've seen in countries where socialized medicine leads to rationing and endless wait times. Harrington's jaw clenched. JD leaned in slightly. Tell me, Senator, if government-run healthcare is such a great idea, why do the politicians who push for it still go to private hospitals? The crowd erupted again. Harrington's lips pressed into a thin line. He knew the question was rhetorical, because everyone already knew the answer. Angela Whitmore interjected. All right, let's shift topics to another pressing issue. Border security and immigration policy. Vice President Vance, you have been a vocal supporter of stricter immigration laws, while Senator Harrington has advocated for a more lenient approach, citing humanitarian concerns. Senator Harrington, what is your response to the Vice President's stance? Harrington exhaled sharply, clearly relieved to move away from the previous topic. Well, Angela, it's no secret that JD and his party have taken a cruel, hardline approach to immigration. Instead of addressing the root causes of migration, they've focused on building walls and militarizing the border, all while ignoring the human cost. He turned toward JD. Let me ask you this, JD. Do you honestly believe that families fleeing violence and poverty should be treated like criminals? JD's eyes darkened slightly. He didn't like when facts were twisted into emotional manipulation. Senator, he said coolly, you and I both know that's not what this is about. This isn't about demonizing legal immigrants. It's about stopping illegal immigration that's overwhelming our system, straining resources, and endangering American communities. He straightened, his voice firm. You talk about the human cost of border security? Let's talk about the real human cost. The fentanyl crisis, the human trafficking rings, the gang violence flooding our cities because of your party's open border policies. Harrington shifted uncomfortably. JD pressed on. You like to frame this debate as compassion versus cruelty. But tell me, Senator, how compassionate is it to let cartels run smuggling operations across an unprotected border? How compassionate is it to allow thousands of unvetted migrants into American communities, knowing full well that criminals and traffickers are exploiting our broken system? Harrington opened his mouth to respond, but JD wasn't finished. You call us cruel, but what's truly cruel is allowing an immigration crisis to spiral out of control just so your party can score political points. Another thunderous round of applause. Even some of the previously neutral audience members were nodding along now. The shift was undeniable. Harrington, realizing he was losing control of the debate, went for the personal attack. You know what, JD? He said, shaking his head. For all your tough talk, it's ironic that you're standing here pretending to be a champion for the working class. Because at the end of the day, you're just another Ivy League politician who got rich and turned his back on the people he claims to fight for. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Harrington smirked, thinking he had landed the final blow. JD didn't even blink. Instead, he let the silence linger, let the moment stretch, owning it. Then with a slow, measured breath, he responded. Senator, he said, I grew up in a broken home in Middletown, Ohio, a town where jobs disappeared because of policies you supported. I watched family members struggle with addiction because the very industries that gave them purpose were gutted in favor of foreign interests. I didn't have lobbyists or political donors paving my way. I earned every single step of my success. He locked eyes with Harrington. And unlike you, I never forgot where I came from. The room exploded. Standing ovation, cheers, claps, a wave of momentum so overwhelming that Harrington physically took a step back. Angela Whitmore tried to regain control. All right, JD raised a hand, signaling he wasn't finished. One last thing, he said, turning back to the crowd. The noise settled. You want to know why I fight? Because I've seen firsthand what bad leadership does to American families. I've seen how Washington politicians on both sides talk a big game about helping the people while selling them out behind closed doors. I refuse to be one of them. His voice never wavered, never rose, but the power behind his words was undeniable. That's why I'm here, JD said. Not for power, not for political points, for the American people, and no amount of personal attacks will change that. The crowd erupted into cheers. Harrington, red-faced and rattled, had nothing left to say. Angela Whitmore, realizing she had lost control of the night, forced an awkward smile. Well, that concludes tonight's debate. Thank you to both of our candidates and to our audience at home. The cameras zoomed out, capturing the clear contrast between the two men. JD Vance standing tall, Harrington looking defeated. And as JD stepped away from the podium, shaking hands with supporters, it was clear to everyone watching at home, this wasn't just a debate. This was a defining moment, and JD Vance had just won. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire and challenge us to grow. What would you have done if you were in his shoes? Let us know in the comments below.